Rick is a professor in organizational analysis at Cardiff Business School, the convener of the Center for Innovation Policy, and has a very long, I would say from my humble standing point, a depressively long record of very key publications. But above all is a friend of the School of Business and Management, and also one of those academics that has been really influential on my own career and to whom I owe a lot. And one of those meetings in my personal academic career that really mattered. So it is a great pleasure to have Rick with us today. And I shall just say that this event was supposed to happen a year ago. I discussed with Rick the eventuality to postpone it for 1 year in the hope that the pandemic would have been over, and how that hope was misguided from my side is under our eyes. But we are here today, and I'm really looking forward for this event. And without further ado, I would like to leave the screen, I shall say, to Rick. Thank you again for coming and joining us.
Thanks very much, Giuliano. I'm hopefully sharing my screen now. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, colleagues, for coming along. What coming along means these days is a bit different from jumping on the train and travelling down to London, in my case, and seeing you in person, which would have been very nice. I've got a number of good friends and colleagues, including Giuliano, in the school. So I remain available for an invitation to join you for dinner at some point in the future. But in the meantime, I'll do my best to present a somewhat engaging and interesting presentation for around 30 minutes or so, I think, if that's okay. And I suppose, like a lot of us, what I'm doing now is not quite the same as what I would have been doing 12 and 18 months ago. So the presentation I'm giving is very much informed by the current work I'm involved in as the university lead in a partnership between ourselves and the Cardiff Capital Region to develop and deliver a challenge fund. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of the fund and that project, but also set that in the context of UK-wide, and in particularly Wales's emerging regional polity, because innovation and the relationships between the different parts of the UK are both in quite a lot of flux at the moment. And I think that's somewhat interesting and potentially will prove to be quite influential on things like UKRI research and innovation policy. So I'll say a little bit about that. And I also finally want to reflect, albeit briefly, but invite the conversation, I suppose, about what I've learned as a business school academic, a management academic, in engaging in this perhaps more applied manner and working in an interdisciplinary research grouping to try and design and deliver policy and innovation instruments in practice. And I'm hoping I'll be able to strike a somewhat optimistic tone in those reflections. So as Giuliano noted, I'm co-convener with 2 colleagues from the School of Geography and Planning of a Centre for Innovation Policy Research. Now, some of you will know some of my work, and I have done work on innovation, although it's probably not the central motif of what I've done. And I've done really relatively little on policy. So you could say, how come have I found myself in this centre? Well, I think that does tell a tale in terms of what I think I'm going to be spending the last part of my career trying to achieve, which is to try and take research and ideas that I've been involved in and have them be influential in policy and practice terms in ways that perhaps help contribute to improvements in society, particularly for our less well-placed and least privileged citizens. And that seems to me where the role of policy can figure quite significantly. So the centre is fairly new and interdisciplinary in nature. There are members from sociology, geography, planning, economic development, and across the business school. And the main programme I'm going to talk to you about is this Challenge Fund, but it's being designed and delivered alongside a skills and capability programme that I'll say a little about. And it's building from some regional policy development, but we're also taking the opportunity to contribute to new policy development. So myself and a couple of colleagues from the centre are in the process currently of conducting a scoping project for existing innovation activity in Wales. We've spoken to 55 contributors on the innovation scene, shall we say, from public, private sector, third sector, because Welsh Government is revisiting and refreshing its innovation strategy. We have elections here in Wales next month, so political parties are in purdah, but we've inputted into some of the political party thinking around a future innovation and research agenda. So we are trying to get more involved, perhaps, than would have been the case, at least for myself, previously. I mean, I've done work that's hopefully been of some relevance and use, for example, to trade unions in the past, and done work that has spoken directly to questions of productivity or quality, and in questions of work, the experience of work. But I've done really relatively less on the policy side, and that's something that we're looking to do more of at the moment. So first, a little bit on the Challenge programme. And I suppose to set the context, the Cardiff Capital Region is one of 2 city deals in Wales, and city deals, you'll have noticed, have been a significant part of UK government's approach to regional economic development, now increasingly referred to as levelling up. Although what that means, how it will be put into practice, what the institutional mechanisms are, is really quite unclear. But city deals have been around for a while now and are at least part of the portfolio. The Cardiff Capital Region includes 10 local authorities and is a total investment fund of £1.2 billion. The bulk of that will be used to invest in transport infrastructure and create a new metro system, which is extending and modelled on the local train network. The rest of the programme has been developed primarily to try and create an evergreen fund that can support projects that will contribute to the growth in GVA and new jobs. And a small part of that funding has been allocated to challenge funds, and we've been given the opportunity to design and deliver in partnership with the City Region a £10 million challenge fund, which is labelled local wealth building and has been designed and agreed in the context of the pandemic. Although these were conversations that predate COVID, it's clearly the key contextual factor in the specifics of how the programme has been designed. We also, and the Centre for Innovation Policy is working alongside a public sector innovation lab, lab that we created in the university in partnership with Nesta. And we also have a Welsh European funding programme around capability development, capacity building, which we hope will complement the Challenge Fund. So we're engaging both in the creation of new funding opportunities for public sector bodies who have challenges that they want to promote innovative solutions for, and a skills and capability development programme in the public sector, looking to build and nurture the capabilities across an innovation ecosystem, if you will. Some of you may be familiar with SBRI, the Small Business Research Initiative, and that's the baseline model that we're building from. We don't want to just replicate it, but it provides us with a basis from which we can build. And in shorthand terms, what we've been doing over the last 6-7 months is looking to convene the public sector around some key societal challenges. 3 were highlighted for us by the Cardiff Capital Region, and they're decarbonisation, transforming communities, and health and well-being. Now they're pretty broad, so it's fair to say that we haven't found much that we can't work into one or more of those. The trick is to work with the public sector bodies for them to specify with sufficient granularity the nature of the challenge that they want to solve that would allow them to radically improve service delivery in whichever area, but that creates new incentives to innovate amongst the private and potentially third sector to produce new ideas, new products, new services, new ways of thinking around this problem, and potentially creates new marketable products or services as part of a subsequent stage of the outcome. So what we're really charged with doing is both addressing societal challenges, in particular public service delivery problems, through the creation of new market opportunities, particularly for local firms, if we can. And we've been working on this for a while. In fact, we had the advisory board meeting today to review the proposals we've got so far. And I'm just giving you these as a flavour of what's come through. We've fast-tracked a proposal from Cardiff and Vale Health Board to explore the opportunities there may be to deliver virtual reality or augmented reality training in tracheostomy and other clinical procedures. And we're working in collaboration with Welsh Government's SBRI Centre of Excellence on that one, and that will go live within the next couple of weeks. And the most promising of the proposals that we've had beyond that are around food security and localising food supply and controlled environment agriculture. A proposal from Transport for Wales, which is wholly owned by Welsh Government, around reusing space in train stations to try and create community assets, and a proposal to try and drive a transition towards the decarbonisation of private homes within the housing sector. Each of those needs more work, but potentially they're the challenges that might come on stream in the next couple of months. And the process involves 3 stages. There's an initial stage where the challenge is put out to the market, as it were, and organisations that feel they might have something to offer by way of a solution to the challenge make their proposals. The most promising of those are selected for feasibility funding, which is typically in the region of £25,000 to £50,000 and runs between 3 and 6 months. They submit their ideas and their more developed proposals, and if there are particularly promising ideas that have come through that process, then there's a prototyping or an investment stage where the ideas can be taken through to being tested, prototyped, trialled. And if that looks particularly promising, then there's the potential for a 3rd round of funding to support taking the proposal to market. And the public sector body that sponsors the challenge is really expected to be the lead procurer of the solution that's produced. Now, SBRI works a similar process, but typically stops at the end of stage 2. And one of the weaknesses of SBRI has been that it hasn't necessarily delivered new market opportunities and commercial outcomes. And that's very much where the capital region is encouraging us to spend time and effort in trying to secure these local wealth building opportunities. So that's the Challenge Fund in a nutshell. And it's an example of the sorts of approach that Mariana Mazzucato has been advocating for a number of years. I'm sure you've come across her. She's very prominent in the media. She's been influential in shaping EU research and innovation policy. And she's written quite a bit about the role of the state in innovation. She's got a new book out at the moment called Moonshot or something. I can't remember exactly. Mission Economy. I haven't read it yet. It's consistent with and builds on previous work that she's talked about the entrepreneurial state and the role of missions in shaping and directing innovation activity. And so our approach is consistent with this because it's adopting this particular challenge approach to stimulating innovation in ways that encourage cross-sector working. And of course, we're working with a city region rather than a government, although the city region is constituted by 10 local authorities, 10 local government actors. And what we're trying to do is support this strategic investment and the potential for innovation that is public sector oriented and public sector led, and has the potential to spill over into multiple sectors, including the foundational economy. And in Wales, we really have quite a weak economy, which is primarily public sector in terms of its makeup, and we have significant components of the economy that are foundational in nature. So we don't have lots of high-tech firms working at the cutting edge of innovation, and that's why this programme is designed in the way that it is, to try and speak to the specific context that we're operating in. So I'm going to sort of broaden out now and talk a little bit more about the context that we're working in and how that speaks to some of the work that's been undertaken. But actually, I'm going to speak more about where we are in the terms of the polity of the United Kingdom, and the view from London, as it were, may well look quite different from the view from Cardiff. So Mazzucato is one of a number of books, and Jeff Mulgan has been another key contributor to these debates recently, that talks in a different way about public sector innovation and the state. So if we go back a few years to Will Hutton's quote here, the idea that the public sector was a hotbed of innovation was very much against the grain. And quite rightly, I think Mazzucato and others have been flying the flag for the state as a co-creator, as an investor, an innovation catalyst, a variety of different forms and roles, rather than a command and control centre, which of course wouldn't work in the first instance. And I think the UK government's initiative around ARIA, which is certainly inspired by some of what they've seen and think they've learned from observing the Defence Agency in particular and its role in innovation in the US, is born of some of this thinking. ARIA is this new innovation agency that will sit at arm's length both from government and from UKRI, and try and catalyse blue skies innovative thinking. So what's the context at UK level that we're working in? Well, you'll have picked up on the regionalisation that's taking place within England, and the big questions that are emerging over the relationship that Scotland will have with the rest of the UK. And it's been quite interesting. I think I've got a number of mates who live in London and in other parts of England, and I think a small and minor consequence of the COVID pandemic has been the recognition more widely that actually some of the rules and some of the regulations and some of the policies are different in Wales and in Scotland and in Northern Ireland than they are in England. So at points in time, Wales has been more open than England, and it's been open in different ways. And I remember I travelled, unfortunately it was for a funeral of a good friend, to Scotland, and we didn't have rules about wearing masks in shops at the time, but when I got out of the car over the border, I was told off for not wearing my mask. And at points in time, Wales has refused to accept visitors from England crossing the border. So I think it's raised in people's consciousness this recognition that we are now further along the devolution process and path than might have been apparent. Education, health, both devolved capabilities within Wales, and we haven't had, for example, we haven't had prescription fees for more than 10 years. So there are variations already, and I think it's not a huge leap to anticipate that we're going to see more of that as a direction of travel. Now, how is that manifesting itself in Wales, and what does that mean for the work we're doing? Well, Wales is juggling two countervailing dynamics currently around how this is playing out. So there's been a traditional over the last 21 years, 22 years coming up of devolution in Wales, where there's been a move of authority and power from London to Cardiff. But we're now seeing a strengthening of a subnational level of regionalism as the different parts of Wales are looking to play increasingly autonomous roles through these city deals that Cardiff and Swansea have, and through growth deals that the two other regions in the north and middle of Wales are home to. This is a new dynamic that the Welsh Government is struggling to come to terms with, not least because it opens up direct lines of communication between somewhere like the Cardiff Capital Region and UK government departments in ways that are making Welsh Government a little uncomfortable, while at the same time UK government is being quite aggressive in sort of how it's seeking to manage devolution, particularly in the context of funding, internal market arrangements, and most recently announcing that a number of different departments, in Wales's case, in Cardiff at least, the Department of Culture, Media and Local Government, will have offices in the devolved nations. And that's, for some at least, a little bit like Whitehall parking its tanks on our lawn. So this is getting quite complicated for Welsh Government. So there have been changes to the development regions of Wales. So we now have four, one centred around Swansea and West, and Swansea is home to a city deal which is funded by UK government. One found in around South East Wales, that's what I've been describing as the Cardiff Capital Region, 10 local authorities, but also a new initiative around Mid Wales, which had previously been bundled together with South West Wales, and an OECD review recommended that was unpacked, and North Wales. Now, this is playing out as we speak. The corporate joint committees were only formed in the last few months, and whether these developments will see more bottom-up regionalism and a loosening of control and resources from Cardiff into the regions, or whether the response from Cardiff, as it becomes more nervous about the relationships that these regions form semi-autonomously with UK government, whether we'll see a greater top-down regionalisation. So this is in tension currently, and it's come through in the scoping work we did on innovation policy just over the last couple of months. The Cardiff Capital Region is very keen to forge relationships with BEIS, with UKRI, and indeed its director is on the Board of Research England, because that's where the money is. they're keen to forge the relationships with UK government and with England because that's where the money is. That's making Welsh government, as you can imagine, quite nervous. And they've actually been encouraged to rein back some of their ambition, which, you know, I personally find somewhat troublesome. So the challenges are at several levels. The political challenge of retaining the solidarity of the 10 municipalities while trying to build a regional institution at that Cardiff Capital Region level. And there is talk even of a regional development agency, which would certainly, I think, concern Welsh Government, which doesn't have its own national development agency at the moment. The Welsh Development Agency was disbanded quite some time ago. So Welsh Government's also nervous about the pace of change within the Cardiff Capital Region and its direct links to UK government and the UK funding bodies. But this is complicated at a UK level as well, because UK government's actions are actually creating quite a lot of consternation within Welsh Government. And in a recent statement to Welsh Parliamentary Affairs Committee, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, actually used the phrase, "the UK is over." And this was, I think, a provocation, or at least some colourful language to describe what he outlines here, which is this perception that UK government is being particularly aggressive and unilateral at the moment, outwardly hostile to the fact of devolution and seeking to marginalise it and bypass it. Now, if you think about the developments that are likely to take place in Scotland, but which also has elections in the next couple of months, it seems to me that we're in a quite an uncertain and uneasy period as the UK, and there are some questions over how that might play out. So, returning to the issues that we've been focusing on most directly around innovation. Our own project and the work we've been doing looking at innovation policy are taking place in this increasingly complex and polycentric polity. And there are issues around the context within which we're working. On the one hand, a more muscular unionism that's coming out of London, and a new centralism that's threatening the devolved nations, while at the same time, an eagerness within those regions, certainly in Wales, to see greater regionalisation of action, new actors coming into that space and seeking to forge their own relationships with UK government. Innovation policy is becoming more like what we're currently doing and more like what Mazzucato has been advocating. So innovation is increasingly recognised as embracing societal challenges and the creation of public value, as well as the established conventional innovation around science and technology and the generation of new technological solutions to problems. And that's promoting the engagement and involvement of a wider group of actors from the third sector as well as the public sector, and encouraging the broadening of the space in which these actors are coming together in coalitions. And you know, we're seeing this, for example, in Greater Manchester, where an announcement only within the last couple of weeks brought together local government leaders, the big businesses that are in the Greater Manchester area, the universities of the Greater Manchester area, and civic society, all aligning around an innovation agenda and lining up to try and secure funding from UK government that is anticipated as part of the levelling up agenda. So there's going to be, I think we're going to see more and more of these developments and a greater complexity to how the innovation agenda is embraced within the regions of the UK, within the English regions, and also within parts of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So, how do I reflect on on these experiences and the work I've been doing as a management academic? Well, I'm sure many of you will have noticed and I can't say that I would have thought this was a characteristic of the debates until fairly recently, but certainly over the last few years, we've seen quite a few of our disciplines more thoughtful and eminent scholars, and Nicole Biggart's a good friend of mine, so I'm very happy to claim her as one of those, but Jerry Davis and Tsui and others, reflecting on the career as they come to the end of it, and at least in Nicole's phrase, wondering how she got entrapped in the theory cave and ended up not being able to engage more beyond that, or regretting that those choices hadn't been taken. At the same time, we've seen an emergence, I suppose most obviously promoted by the paper by Fabrizio Ferraro and colleagues around management academics' contribution to addressing grand societal challenges. Jerry George and AMJ promoted that language as well recently. But of course, in an essay published in JABS only a month or two ago, Bill, again friends and I'm sure known to many of you, including I think Peter was former colleague, Bill Harley and Peter Fleming actually analysed the content of the 7 leading North American management journals and found less than 3% of the papers published in there over the last 10 or 12 years, I think it was, actually having anything to do with anything that might even be vaguely recognised as a grand societal challenge, whether that's poverty, sustainability, climate change, or so on. And that, of course, has also prompted some reflection on what we might be doing and what we should be doing. And Alessia Contu wrote a nice paper in Human Relations 2019 talking about intellectual activism and advocating for business school scholars to make more of a difference. And in some ways, I commented in a little similar vein in a JMS piece a few years ago, embracing the public sociology that Michael Burrowood had advocated and building on the work of John Brewer on public value. And as some of you may have seen, Martin Kitchen and I have written on how the school in Cardiff has embraced a public value strategy and infused our activities, whether that's teaching, research, engagement, or our own internal organisation, infused those with a commitment to and a sensibility around public value. Appeared back end of last year in AMLE. So, final slide, some reflections, and then the opportunity, hopefully, to have some discussion, albeit in these slightly challenging arrangements. I think attempting to engage around societal challenges and develop and deliver something of practical value has reinforced to me something I think I've always thought of as positive, but maybe in abstract terms rather than specific terms, the value of interdisciplinarity, the value of bringing together people who really understand the public sector with people who really understand regional economic development, with people that have a really good grasp of policy, bringing groups together and engaging with practitioners and policymakers in the design and development of the programme, as well as its delivery. As you know, that emphasis on the practical has really brought home that value, the value of doing that in collaborative ways. That said, I think we as a, and I know it's a big we group, but we as a group of management and organisation researchers have valuable expertise to offer. And I think once you get out there and talk to people and reflect on the research that you've done or that you've read, and some of what it might say and some of what it might encourage in terms of thinking, critical thinking, challenging of conventions, I think people see that value. And it helps, I think, if there's a shared enterprise and a shared agenda, a common purpose through which some of those conversations are being convened. And certainly, you know, colleagues, if we are to avoid sliding back into some of the worst of how our economy is organised and its consequences in a post-pandemic period, in a way that I think I would say very much it feels as though we, you know, the great global financial crisis of 2008 or so saw us return to something rather looking like the old normal rather than a new normal. Then we need innovative and ambitious approaches when it comes to policy, and of course much more beside, but policy levers are ways in which we can try and embed and establish influences over practice in ways that are different and encourage us to avoid some of the same old mistakes. And so in that context, my final reflection is to actually, Alessia and I gave a presentation. We were both part of a panel presenting to Newcastle University the other day, and this is one of a number of talks that I've attended or presented to that, at least in part, has been driven by the experiences of colleagues in Leicester and the attack on research that's critical and that embraces political economy there. And she concluded her presentation in reflecting on the role of intellectual activism. And I'm not claiming to be quite that in what I'm doing, but she said it's hard to do, but it's also joyous and hopeful. And I'd like to think I've encouraged you to have some hope. And of course, you know, the joy would have been in the pub beer garden afterwards, but we can't do that yet. So thank you, colleagues, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Rick, for such an amazing presentation. So now it's time for the Q&A. So what I'll do is I'll promote everyone over to a panelist, and you can feel free to turn on your camera or your microphone and ask Rick any questions that you may have. So I'll just do that now.
Can I ask a question while all the cameras are popping up and people will be able to turn on their cameras and microphone? Can I ask a question? First of all, thank you, Rick, for a very interesting presentation that gives a lot to think about in terms of the relationship between government and governments and innovation and the role of intellectuals and academics and the role of academics as practitioners that contribute to social innovation. It was obviously fascinating to see the dynamics between the devolved governments and the central UK government. And of course, I was wondering if you could say something about the impact of the EU referendum and the withdrawal of the UK from the EU, because I think that that has affected perhaps not the level of funding, but the channels of funding to innovation projects. So I was wondering if you could say something about the comparison between the pre-referendum situation and the post-referendum situation.
Yeah, well, that's an important issue, an important funding issue beyond the research and innovation context, because Wales was actually, parts of Wales were actually the only parts of the EU that received structural funding on through each of the 3 waves. So Wales has been a major net beneficiary of EU funding and support. And what UK government has needed to do is develop a series of plans, or it's put forward a series of plans that would compensate's not the right word, but would respond to the loss of funding that the poorest and least healthy regions of the UK, including those in Wales, would be receiving. Now, that whole process has been changed to the disadvantage of the regions within England and beyond by an increasingly, I think the phrase on the slide was muscular unionism on the part of UK government. So what Wales thought it would be getting in terms of support to compensate for the loss of funding from the EU across the piece is not happening in the way that it had been led to believe. When we get to the specifics of innovation and research, I suppose research and innovation is devolved, but the funding is not, if that makes sense, in Wales. So we have to participate in the REF, like you guys, but the funding pot is received by Wales and then allocated through a different means. And innovation funding is largely propped up by Welsh funding, because we've not had the equivalent of the HIFE fund in Wales for quite some time. So on the plus side, because we have devolved responsibility, Wales has announced its version of Erasmus Plus, which is a much better scheme than I think it's called the Turing scheme that English universities are currently being presented with. So there are pros and cons, but the bottom line is that Wales is a poor nation, and unless UK government provides the sort of funding support that the EU was providing, the fear and expectation is that we'll be poorer still. And one should point out that although Cardiff did not vote for Brexit, the majority of Wales did.
Thank you.
So I think people are able to actually join and actually voice their question now. We're all together, aren't we? I know it doesn't feel like we're all together, but so I can see Roland's got a hand up there. I don't know whether, Julian, are you going to change?
Oh, yes.
Shall I just shout out when I see a hand?
No, Roland has got a hand. Please, Roland.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation, Rick, and for joining us today. Just interested in the notion of public value that you mentioned on the way, and so it's a topic that you've already published on. I was just interested in what role that term might have had for you in these particular kinds of engagements, and what notion of value you might have held in terms of your own engagements, but also maybe the other notions and understandings of value that you might have encountered with the different partners and stakeholders that you've been working with, and how those things might have sat together.
Yeah, thank you. Really good question. We could have spent our hour just talking about different forms of value, innovation that produces and creates different forms of value. So in a nutshell, I found the short book by John Brewer very stimulating when I read that quite some time ago now. It prompted, in part, it didn't prompt me to write, but it featured heavily in a piece I wrote for JMS at the time around how critical management studies or critical management scholars could embrace his conception of public value and work with the notion of public sociology that Michael Burrowoy had advanced to try and be more impactful in what we, again, a very broad conception of we, might think we were trying to see happen in the world. The world's changed, but some of those key principles remain relevant to how I see what I'm trying to do, I think. I mentioned, and I think somebody in the Q&A asked about this sort of socio-ecological innovation conception. The landscape for innovation has been changing, and it's not something that you'll hear so much about in engineering departments or physical science departments. I fear it's not something you hear enough about at UKRI yet, but the role of innovation in the public sector and the role of social innovation that is driven by trying to address societal challenges, is much more prominent than it has been in the past. And I think almost by definition, that means we've got innovation that is at least potentially producing public value, things that are of value to wider society beyond economic value that is likely to be captured by the private sector. Now in Wales, that's a fairly positive message to present, because as I said, we are a public sector dominated economy, and overall we are a Labour voting region of the UK. The Welsh Labour Party has never lost a national election. It'll be interesting to see how the elections go in May. So that broader, what my friend Kevin would call that capacious conception of value within a wider innovation agenda, is more credible, is getting more traction, and I can live with the suggestion that we need to see economic value and public value go hand in hand. So, as I said, our role is to try and create commercial opportunities for local firms, as well as solve societal solves to ground, as well as address and ameliorate societal challenges. And I think we can live with that until the revolution comes. I suppose I should add that Wales has one particular piece of legislation that is very interesting and important. I should probably have, well, I should certainly have mentioned this previously. Wales was the first nation in the world to produce legislation to enact the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's called the Future Generations Act. And all activity undertaken by public sector bodies in Wales should be consistent and cognizant of this Future Generations Act and the implications of actions for future generations across the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is a different business context here, and there is a different civic society context where public value, social value, and economic value are probably more comfortably recognised as being potentially complementary. But that's a cracking question, Roland, and it's difficult to do justice to it in a few short minutes.
Thank you very much.
Let me see if I see other hands up.
So the question I noticed from Marcelo
and
was around the socio-ecological. So just a word on that, I guess. So that was my shorthand for innovation that is not technological and science driven, but is rather oriented around social or ecological sustainability, climate change type challenges and problems. That's what I was referring to there. So the driver for innovation, and one might extend from that and anticipate the process and outcomes of innovation are different in that broader conception of what constitutes innovation. Thanks for the question, Marcelo.
Irina, would you like to ask a question?
And do you hear me? Do you see me? Right?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much for your presentation. It was really quite interesting because I study regional development and urban development. And I wanted to ask you whether you studied or considered the role of local communities as one of the stakeholders of local economic development in Cardiff region.
Yeah, great question. And the honest answer is, personally and within the Challenge Fund programme, no, not really. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But other colleagues in the business school, and in fact I know this because we were allowed to have dinner outside in the cold with them last week, are exactly engaging with local communities on their particular needs and interests in ways that are largely uninformed by the whole sort of complex polity context that I was painting, which means very little to the citizens of Grangetown or Rhondda when it comes to the economic difficulties or the poor health and well-being that they're suffering. So the question then comes, how do those conversations come together? For us, the only way we could even suggest that what we're doing will speak directly to those issues is when particularly civil society and third sector organisations are involved in the conversations that we're having. And third sector organisations are eligible to propose challenges for funding, just like the public sector. So it does take those third parties to mobilise in communities, but we're not in a position where we could organise that for them, as it were. So we're reliant on those voices coming through, in particular the third sector civil society organisations, which is a fairly well developed sector within Wales for unsurprising reasons. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Fernando?
Yes, here I just found it. Not very accustomed to Zoom. Thank you, Rick, for the presentation. It was really illustrating. I have one question. So you mentioned several times about the policy changes that are needed surrounding innovation, and not only the technological issues. Do you think that the research funding councils have been innovative enough to actually allow this innovative research that probably is needed too? I mean, in one part you mentioned that when scholars are reaching more than their maturity, they are ready to retire, they start to think, oh, well, I should have done this. And the question is, if they should have done that before they are the renowned person there, will the research councils be able to meet the challenge, or will be always these rejected projects that they take on when they're like you, that you can probably present new things and people will listen to?
Very, very good question. And the short answer is no, I don't think so. I should confess to having been the university's Dean of Research and Innovation for 7 years until I finally served my term and managed to escape. So I had an institutional role in engaging with UKRI and the research councils, and things have changed, but things have not changed enough. And particularly in the innovation space, I think the STEM logic, a linear logic of technological innovation, is still the dominant and default way of conceiving and articulating what's meant by innovation. I think there are some changes, but there's a long way to go. And I personally, as a social scientist, have long flown the flag for social science and what we can contribute across the piece in the innovation agenda. And again, slow progress, frankly. And although I painted a positive picture, one with which I agree that it's important to engage in policy development, frankly, social scientists need to be allowed into more than the policy space when it comes to how technologies will be applied. We need to be built in to the planning and design of the research programs that produce the technologies. And I think that there is some recognition of that, but it's slow progress, I have to say. Again, a great question. You're not asking me questions where I can maintain my positive and optimistic outlook.
Can I step in briefly on this point, because I think that there is also a risk that is linked to the kind of technological waves we are in, because when we think about technological innovation in terms of platforms, smart cities, infrastructures to support this kind of technological innovation, it is easy for the general public, but sometimes also for some academics, to equate this kind of investments in infrastructure for smart city connectivity platforms and so on and so forth to public good and public interest. And probably that could shift the balance toward focusing on the technological side of the innovation. I don't know whether this is a fair comment or not.
Well, I mean, I think my position would be it's not an either-or question, but we've surely got more than enough evidence to show that new technologies are far more effective in delivering what the technologists themselves actually want to try and achieve if the design and development of those technologies is done with input from people who understand the species that are expected to adopt and utilize the technology in due course, which is us human beings. And we aren't terribly accessible to many engineers and physicists, it would seem. They don't necessarily understand us. So I think it's the combination that is interesting and is the rich space to try and work in. And like I say, there have been some shifts. There are, ESRC, I'm on the strategic advisory network for ESRC, and they are more involved in UKRI research programs than they perhaps were in the past. But there's still quite a small voice and quite an impoverished voice when it comes to the funding. And it's rare that ESRC leads on these initiatives. Now, I was also part of the COVID emergency response assessment panels for ESRC that ran throughout most of last year. And ESRC handled more proposals, funded more proposals, and allocated more funding than any other part of RC UK. So when the response to the pandemic was at its greatest in terms of research and rapid research responses. People came to ESRC. Now, hopefully that will demonstrate to people who are less convinced that the economic and social sciences have a crucial role to play in how we respond to health issues, environmental issues, and other issues that are often assumed to be largely technological in terms of the likely solution. Like I said, I'm an optimist.
Thanks. I see Perry has got a hand up.
Oh, Rick, good to see you again, if only in pixels.
Yeah, hi Perry, how are you?
Fine, thanks. I wanted to ask a question about the context for the promotion of innovation, because this context is changing very rapidly, and there were some aspects of it that I didn't hear you reflect on. You only had 30 minutes. The world's de-globalizing remarkably quickly. We're seeing China's dual circulation policy. We're seeing Buy American from the Biden administration. Brexit is obvious. We hardly need dwell on that. We're seeing strategic autonomy policies from the European Union. Now, on the one hand, I can see that giving a real powerful push to a certain kind of public sector innovation work, because deglobalized states tend to want to be domestically stronger and so promote innovation policies. On the other hand, the kind of innovation that they want to push in deglobalization tends to be very nation bound. It's import substitution, it's very disconnected. It also cultivates, and this goes to your point about public sector innovation, much weaker learning across the big blocks of countries, and it tends to attenuate that kind of social learning network. I wondered, given that Wales, of course, is a country that remembers with great bitterness the last deglobalization, from which in some ways the Welsh economy never really recovered, what kind of thinking you as a group and the Cardiff City region and perhaps even Welsh government have had, and what you've gone through as you reflect on those deglobalizing pressures, and what kinds of, on the one hand, imperatives for, but on the other hand, misshaping of innovation imperatives that this creates?
Yeah, that's another excellent and very complicated question, which I'm not sure I could do justice if we had the hour on it, never mind 2 minutes. So I don't disagree with the picture you painted. I suppose the only caveat to that would be the highly resonating recognition of the international response that the vaccination programs have constituted in the pandemic. So quite how people make sense of those competing narratives in the next few years will be interesting. But you're right, closer to home, there's much more of a sense of Little Britain, and within that, Wales struggles to see much past the Severn Bridge anyway, I would have to say, and so that doesn't really help. And what also doesn't help, and in the report we've just written, we make this point, it doesn't help that Wales, as other regions of the UK have done, feel compelled to claim to being world class at things that they would barely be noticed at all in doing by the regions of the world that are actually world class and operating at scale. And so our advice has been to scale back on those claims, to rethink innovation strategy and move away from trying to pick winners and subsidise promising firms and sectors, and instead think much more in terms of an innovation commons, investing in the resources, the skills and capabilities, creating a landscape that's fertile for innovative activity, non-sector specific, to try and encourage more innovation activity that finds its own way and doesn't need to comply to UK government or Welsh government perceptions of what the priorities would be at a point in time. There's been some interesting work on innovation commons. I'm not quite sure it needs to be quite as technical as the person who's written about it the most has made it, but I quite like it as a shorthand for investing in the conditions where innovative activity can flourish, rather than trying to spot winners and plough a load of public funding into propping up capitalist businesses that may or may not make it on the world stage.
Let me see if I can see other hands up.
It's about now, I'd say, well, why don't we continue this conversation in the pub, Juliana? But
well, there is Fernando with an hand up, I think, but absolutely, it goes without saying that this kind of online events, apart from my manifest ineptitude to master Zoom, I'm more a Teams person, come quite short on the relational side. And yes, I'm missing the pub now, as you would imagine, and I think all our participants are missing the pub. And further conversation, the follow-up on the pub for sure. So I can just hope that, yes, we will have a pub session as soon as we are allowed to in the next future, and here in London. Fernando.
No, it was just a comment, say that actually we can or we could get together for a pub as far as it's outside. So Rick, I mean, you are welcome to come anytime you want, just for the pub, the presentation. It just, let's do it in stages. Today is the presentation, and a different day we get together for the pub. It was just a comment.
Well, it was a coincidence, but this week when the pub beer gardens opened in England, and I received a whole load of messages from my pals who live in London with them flaunting their opportunity to go drinking in pub beer gardens. The 12th of April was actually, you may not have noticed it, colleagues, but it was the day that Wales opened its borders. So until the 12th, I wouldn't have been allowed to visit you anyway, unless me coming to talk to you was deemed to be essential work, which I'm not sure I could have kept a straight face and tried to maintain. Yes, you're right. In the near future, perhaps we can get together. Let's hope we're on the upward slope now.
But yeah, let me also say that it was also interesting in the presentation how the political level and the practice of being an academic were analyzed together and or mentioned together. And I think that this links to the team of the research group that has organized this event. This is the Organizational Practice and Processes group because it was interesting to see how the political process and the academic practice interlink together. But going back to the discussion about technology and social value, I particularly noticed your point about involving in the innovation process the people that and those who understand and analyze the impact of new technologies on people and society. And this struck me quite a lot because incidentally, the subject that I teach at the moment is innovation and new product development in the context of platform development. And the amount of time we spent with students to talk about issues of ethics and issues of diversity and communication was incredible, and that was a bottom-up process that emerged from the seminars, so from the students. So if their question was to do a particular analysis using platform theory and so on and so forth on a specific innovation, the conversation was very often shifting on issues of ethics, for example, in relation to artificial intelligence and big data analysis and machine learning, or on diversity and how to communicate to the diverse communities on a platform that, yes, enable communication, but not so much, because that communication only happen if there is a deeper understanding and deeper appreciation of diversity and different kind of language and implicits that different people can use. So I think that was quite an important point that you highlighted, and reminded me of this conversation that we're naturally developing in my classes.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And I'm on the Strength in Places assessment panel, and one of the successful proposals in the first round came from Scotland and was looking at digital technologies in the financial sector, AI and machine learning in banking and so on. And what was interesting and particularly impressive about it was it was actually led by the business school and social scientists, and the ethical issues and the practical and regulatory issues around the technologies were at the forefront of the proposal. So I think that is where most of the interesting and important thinking is taking place at the moment.
Thanks, Rick. Fernando, I saw that you had your...
Yes, I'm sorry to try to bombard Rick's optimism. It seems that I keep doing that. So what I did is with the regulatory aspect of exactly of these issues that we've been discussing. And the question is whether you see that, yes, you're right. So more and more at research and certain policy levels, there is a recognition that this techno-solutionism that we've been seeing in the last 20 years is leading to no probably nice place from the society point of view. But at the upper levels of political decision, is this actually being taken into account, or still just because it happened that globally we have very bad politicians in charge of the planet, we still give most of important decisions related to innovation and technology development to technologists, not taking into account the social scientists. I mean, probably I'm a little pessimistic, and you seeing something different. So you think that there is like a gap between those that take decisions at very high level, which there is still a lot of techno-voluntarism or techno-solutionism, and the recognition that that is leading to no a nice place if you see the last 20 years.
Well, of course, a lot of what is going to be the most important innovation activity is taking place in businesses. So, you know, we are going to be hugely beholden to how big corporations determine what's best for them, while parroting notions of what's good for society. So I'm not at all optimistic about that, to be frank. I was talking specifically about government funding and UK government funding for research and innovation, I think there is slow recognition that much of what they're trying to support happening benefits from a greater focus on the challenge rather than the technology, on society rather than the producers and technologists, and on collaboration that's cross-sectoral and multidisciplinary rather than another round of funding into engineering lab X in the Golden Triangle. So I think it's possible to believe those things to be true and still be somewhat pessimistic. But I think all of those things are true, actually. And I think the move towards global challenges, that language and that structuring of that part of the innovation agenda, it remains to be seen what's happened to industrial strategy, but industrial strategy challenges were also somewhat helpful in how they shaped the activity. Look, you think it's bad now? I've been around 30 years and it's been a lot worse. Maybe that's where my optimism comes from.
I don't see other hands up. I'm trying to understand where to search for them. So I'm getting more and more expert in Zoom as well. But I think that we are about to reach the time where we can go to the pub, or should have gone to the pub. So let me thank you again, Rick, for this wonderful talk and for taking the time to join us. And I would like also to thank you all the participants. I see some friends from Italy joining us. Ciao. And all the friends in the Organizational Practices and Processes Research Group. I think it was an interesting talk. From my personal point of view, too bad it came after a long day of intense teaching, without even the pub at the end. So, but it was very enlightening, and thank you again, Rick, for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation, Giuliano, and look forward to seeing hopefully many of you in person in the future. Thanks ever so much for committing some of your time. I'm sure you had a whole host of other things you could have been doing, including, if you're in England, going to a pub beer garden. So I appreciate you taking the time out, and some great questions, great conversation. I hope I don't think I did, but I hope I didn't give the impression that I had many of the answers, but I'm trying to encourage you to think that there is some hope, as I said, and that engaging with these more practical and societal challenges is worthwhile and is possible. So I hope I've given you some encouragement in that regard, at least. But much appreciated again, Giuliano, and thank you for the questions. Thanks, everybody.